Animals do not see physical death as something to be feared. Or I mean, I think we humans are unique in trying to avoid the inevitable, to the extent that we do, and with the anxiety that we do. Of course, there's the survival imperative, and a prey animal is still going to run away from the lion that's chasing it. Of course, there's the survival imperative. But when the lion catches up to the impala and has it in the death grip, around the throat here, even though the impala's body might be struggling and it's going through the dying process, you'll see that the eyes of the impala are calm. They're not super wide in fright necessarily. They're not glazed over from shock. They're calm. They've accepted what's coming. And yes, all the other species aside from human really do deeply know and regard death as just a transition in a state of being. It's just a transition in a state of being. You have a body and then you don't. And it's what's very important to them is quality of life, wild and domestic.
Well, Anna, lovely to meet you, and I've been so looking forward to conversing with you, because animals for a long time have been incredibly close to my heart. Since I was a kid, I've just always been drawn toward being with animals more so than people, which, for whatever reason, love people too, but I really love animals. And I think I mentioned off air, I came across a video from about 15 years ago with a gorgeous black panther where I was introduced to your work of talking, and I don't want to put too much language around this until you go into it, but telepathically, to my understanding, with this incredibly beautiful black panther, and its behavior changed somewhat instantaneously through your conversation. And it really drew me in so much because it's an intuitive feeling that I had it as a child, that these capacities we had as human beings to talk so much more broadly to the world and to the creatures on this planet than what we're somewhat told in this very reductionist, materialistic culture, that all that we have is what we can sense and see and feel, as opposed to a much larger scope of consciousness that exists within us, and obviously encases the whole universe which we're in. So thank you for opening that portal for myself, and I'm sure many, many millions of other people. But I would like to start with, how did you initially get into this work that you're doing, or the work that you did initially do with speaking with animals, and now the conservation?
Well, thanks for that great intro and speaking to the very issue of the paradigm that we generally buy into being the biggest block to us incorporating these ways of being. It's not a superpower. It's not some skill that I went to a mystery school for, Hogwarts or otherwise. And it does, even as an adult now, as I do this with my days, it does hearken to the childhood years where this was just completely natural. I now only in recent years have had memories of just knowing how the family pet dog was feeling. And even when there were no, outward symptoms, or driving along in the child seat in the back of the car and suddenly screaming and crying and begging my mom to stop because I felt there was an injured, porcupine off in the woods, off the verge, and couldn't be seen from the road. And I was inconsolable, and so she turned back, and indeed, there it was. So these things are natural and normal, I've come to see. It really is the way that our human brains are designed. It is the blueprint of our original design. And it's how we are wired, not only as seeming individuals, but in the sense of being tapped into our greater environment in situ. And that probably harkens back also to some very real and appropriate survival mechanism. Even though we are predators as a species and apex predators at that, we'd still need to be aware of subtle signals, both to find food or avoid getting chomped by bigger predators, in the good old days before we developed technology to take ourselves out of that equation and separate ourselves. But we'll talk more a bit about that later. To answer your most recent question about how I got into it, is that I was sort of living in two worlds at the same time. Very ordinary suburban upbringing. So once again, no privilege, safaris or wild camping, just a very ordinary suburban upbringing, very academically orientated. Got good results at school, got the university degree, entered the corporate world, which was all very mentally stimulating, working in business analysis and project managing software installations and so on. But my real passion had been wanting to follow this urge of being interested in working with animals. My family couldn't afford to send me to the only veterinary university in South Africa, so that's why I settled on business and psychology degree. But I satisfied my hankering by volunteering, always volunteering, be it, bird rescue and squirrel rescue every Wednesday and Thursday nights when I was working in Silicon Valley in California, or in South Africa in my late 20s, I trained as a cheetah handler to work with the big spotted cats in the conservation education context with animals who couldn't be returned to the wild, and using that opportunity to help children in particular do as our logo said, see it, sense it, and save it. So I was a big cat handler by the time I moved to the US. Not a whole lot of cheetahs running around there, so I turned my hand to wolf conservation and volunteered at a wolf sanctuary, just, shoveling muck and doing what you got to do. And again, conservation education. So yeah, volunteering along the way was almost like my sort of parallel alternative resume. And it was when I was in the US and feeling particularly sort of corporatized and overly mental that I tried to find a way to satisfy my love for nature. I'd been on plenty of hiking trips and that before, and I decided to learn tracking, as in following the signs and trails and tracks left by animals out there in the wild to uncover the stories of what had happened, before the human got there, to see the footprints or whatever. And very fortunately, I did some tracking courses and went every Saturday morning on a little tracking club with an organization, a nonprofit organization founded by the man who would become my Nature Connection mentor, John Young. And the Wilderness Awareness School that he founded, or at hshields.org, you could find out information about their practices. It comes from a very deep anthropological research and tapping into the wisdom of how indigenous cultures around the world have been successful at knowing place, Hunters, gatherers, successful communities, both hemispheres, north and south, have certain common principles. And that is around some core routines and nature awareness. And every little toddler could tell the language of the birds and what that meant for who else was invisibly, moving in the woods or in the sand dunes of the Kalahari. And it was very fortunate that I was learning tracking or being mentored in tracking through this group who were helping us see through native eyes, as was the name of one of their programs. Because it wasn't just about being thrown a guidebook, a textbook, and being told to study up on what footprints look like and then cognitively, visually recognize those in the field and correctly identify. We would go out into the field and, of course, discover footprints or other sign like broken branches or mucus or saliva somewhere or some chewed leaves. But the very last question we were wanting to resolve was, which animal was it? We would come about it in a discovery way. We would, sure, look at the size of the tracks and then where's the next footprint? And based on the distance between the 2 feet, we get a sense of the length of the animal's body, sort of shoulder to hips. And that would start to give us some clues. We'd get down, examine it not only with our eyes, but smell it, feel and understand why it passed here, not 2 meters to the left or 2 meters to the right. Like, what was the reason for the animal being exactly there? How were they moving? Relaxed, running, walking, startled, jumping, which would tell a lot about their behavior. And one can't help but get into the animal's perspective when you're so deeply exploring. One's empathy is automatically activated. If one definition of empathy can be to know and understand the truth or the perspective of the other. And eventually out of that might emerge, that this is, a certain kind of animal. And so you're really getting fully into the experience of the animal when they passed and they left this not only physical sign, like a footprint in the mud, but also the sort of energetic imprint of, what was going on at that time that they passed. So this was all how my tracking instruction was going. But early on, we were going through a process like this with some perfect four-toed footprints in dried mud. Couldn't have asked for a more perfect track, a really, easy lower grade example for anyone who knew anything about North American animals. They immediately knew what animal it was. But I grew up in South Africa. I didn't really know what the different North American species were, much less what the bottom of their feet looked like. And so I began to ask some questions, but the mentor doesn't give you answers. They help you find the answers yourself.
Mm.
And so I was told to close my eyes and hold my hand over the track and see what happened. And I thought, well, he was just barking mad, but I didn't have any other options. So I did that. And immediately what came to mind was a mental image of a rather scraggly, scruffy, sort of pointed dog like face. Not red like I would expect a fox to be, not really brown like the jackals I know, brown and black in Southern Africa, more grey, not big enough to be a wolf, and against a backdrop of a sort of hollowed out cave almost in a sandbank, where in the space behind this animal's face that I saw, there was just a sort of there was just dark space, but hanging in the air were some grass roots, because obviously it had been dug out. So my eyes flew open. I described what I saw, and the instructor said, "Yes, well done. That is a coyote's track." And I said, "What's a coyote?" I didn't know it was like a small wild canid, wild dog species in the US. So this happened around 8 in the morning, and then we set about following the trail, which, waxed and waned, sometimes visible, sometimes not. And 2 hours later, around 10 in the morning, we came to the edge of the river, and on the riverbank was exactly that scene that I had in my mind, got this vision about 2 hours before. Of course, the coyote was long gone. It heard us coming and was long gone. But there was this exact lair with the
Mm.
grass roots hanging in the empty space. And moreover, the obvious footprints right outside the lair were 2 hours old, or within 2 hours old, which basically meant that 2 hours earlier at 8 in the morning, I'd be getting real time information. And so
So,
that became super interesting and a bit scary, quite frankly. It
yeah.
wasn't just kind of sensing what species of animal it was in general. It was really that I had tapped into that absolute individual where they were at that time.
Mm. You're seeing through.
And
It's almost like
no
you.
way to understand that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's more. It's like you're seeing. So, do you think you're actually seeing through that coyote's eyes at that
Yeah.
particular moment? You've tapped into it.
Exactly.
It's almost like
That's right.
remote viewing for animals.
Yeah, yeah, it is. It is like that. And in the sense, technical remote viewing is sort of like having a bird's eye view, where you're sort of hovering over the scene and seeing all the
Mm.
components. But this form of intuitive connection and communication really is having their experience and seeing through their eyes. So, it'd be looking out and seeing what they're seeing, which becomes relevant when you're trying to help an animal, for example. In 2017, I was living in coastal South Africa that's had the largest and most devastating fires in recorded history in South Africa. 1,400 homes were lost, quite a few human lives, and just, thousands upon thousands of animal
Mm.
lives.
Mm.
And the absolute emergency of it went on for over 2 weeks. And there was an occasion where there was some animals stuck behind a farmer's fence, and this wall of fire just bearing down on them. I could barely breathe 100 meters away because the heat was so intense. And I could see, there was one place where I could go and open a gate, and I did, but they were crazed and alarmed and running around in a blind panic in circles in the swirling smoke. And by now it's second nature for me to, if I'm going to be giving an instruction or a suggestion to an animal, to imagine it from their perspective. So I was standing facing them in the field, and the gate was on my right. But I had to switch perspective, imagining I was on their side of the fence with all the smoke and the chaos and the wall of flame behind me. And I was encouraging them to move to their left, my right, their left, just head for the left corner. And when you get there, you'll find this gap. And they did. So we really are seeing, hearing, smelling their experience, which used to be helpful when I early on, and I don't anymore, but when I early on was doing missing animal cases. And I don't do pet consultations at all the last 10 years or so. I focus exclusively on wildlife. But imagine when somebody's beloved companion animal is missing and they don't know why they left or where they are. You would literally ask the animal telepathically, yeah, you're not just where are you? Because you're not going to give you GPS coordinates that you
I'll drop
would
your pin.
say exactly. Yeah, please drop your pin.
Yeah.
Exactly. You could say, like, what do you see? What can you hear? What can you smell? Like, get very specific with the sensory information. And if there's something unusual about the environment that they're in or something unique, then that becomes a clue. I've managed to have people find a cat who was hiding underneath a boat in someone's driveway. And, they'd put a cover over the boat because it wasn't the sailing season, but there they were hiding there. Or another dog who was also hiding somewhere behind a compost pile, but he reported hearing an intensity in car sounds and traffic, twice a day, basically during the commuter period. So we knew he was near a freeway where he was found. So you really are tuning into their experience. It's very direct. You're not a sort of disembodied remote viewer, but it is remotely connecting with them and asking them to share their experience, which is also how we can feel how they're feeling in their bodies, know how they are experiencing symptoms, and even without being a medical person, I can describe how they are feeling physically to a veterinary professional who might then understand it. If I can say how superficial or deep the pain is it there constantly or only sometimes with certain body movements? Is it an ache or a sharp pain? And for that matter, what does the animal need to make it better? Because often they know. They often know exactly what they need to have changed or what form of treatment they might need. They seem to be tapped into the sort of universal library of all knowledge in that way. It's quite mysterious and yet just very real.
Mm. Oh, well, you see it when they're unwell. They often, particularly, well, my experience predominantly around dogs, canines, is that they would know what to do when they're sick.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
with your so when these abilities came back online for you, so you obviously were quite tapped in as a child to this field, and then that's re-emerged when you're an adult. Did it all come flooding back? Was once that door was opened, or did you have to cultivate? I mean, how did you place it also within your experience coming from, I guess, a very left brain orientated corporate job, and all of a sudden these I get, not to be too neuroscience about it, but what we understand to be more of the right side really came online. Um,
Mm.
yeah, what was it? What was
Yeah,
that
well, it
process for you?
wasn't just a tsunami that picked me up and that I sort of happily surfed into, the nirvana of communion with all life. No, it
Yeah.
was it was very, very challenging. I didn't know what was going on, tried to suppress it, couldn't explain it, so I tried to push it aside, but kept on knocking at the door. So I decided to do one of two things, either voluntarily go for psychiatric evaluation because I was
Oh wow.
hallucinating
Yeah.
or do some research, and I'm serious. I really was like, wow, I'm not well, like something's happening. Maybe I've got a brain tumor, they just sort of popped open some portal. But luckily, I first did a bit of online research and discovered that there was this whole field called, telepathic interspecies communication. So I was somewhat comforted. I thought at least I'm not the only crazy if this is just insane. And I was living in the US at the time, and there's, hundreds of practitioners and teachers there. And so I chose carefully to undertake some studies with a beautiful heart-centered organization, a nonprofit called the Assisi International Animal Institute, and their founder, who is a practicing professional psychologist, she brought together three main foundations. One was indigenous knowledge. The second was quantum physics or new physics to explain as much as we know about, telepathy and Rupert Sheldrake's experiments and so on, and intention experiments and fields. And the third aspect was the very sort of Buddhist-centric compassion for all life. And so over the next 2 years, I used the grand sum total of my 10 days annual leave from my corporate job to study various courses, weekend workshops, 5-day workshops, 10-day workshops in problem solving and counseling. And I also opted to pursue practitioner certification, which required doing heaps of case studies, double-blind case studies, working with communicating with animals we didn't know previously, who lived with people we didn't know previously. And we would be given some set questions to ask. Only the animal's person knew the answers, and also to address any emotional, behavioral, whatever physical issues might be going on. And then the animal's person, would give feedback to the institute, independently, and we would get coached around that, our communication that we would transcribe and the person's feedback and, the problem resolution or not. And I found those case studies the best thing for my very doubting mind. I needed that for the inner skeptic, because try as I might, there were just some things I could not explain away. I really, I would try to find all sorts of reasons. And sure, a lot of what goes on for domesticated animals in particular can be explained, or, most dogs like to play with a ball, things like this. You could just say, oh, well, no wonder the dog likes a ball. But there were some things that were just startling. There was one Rottweiler I was communicating with, for example, and one of the standard questions was to ask the animal, is there anything missing from your life? And yeah, usually they'd want more food, more walks, whatever. But in this case, I got again a flash of a mental image, but it doesn't have to come, visually, internally. That this intense feeling of emotional missing, and then a brief flash of the upper part of a man's arm, and a beautiful bald eagle flying through the sky. And I would have discounted it and not even mentioned it to the person, because it was just ridiculous, had no context, and I didn't understand it. But per the protocol, we were honor bound to write and report everything, so I did. And when I gave the lady feedback over the phone, she burst into tears and said that her young husband, in his early 30s, had died the year before in a car crash, and he had had a tattoo of a bald eagle's head on his bicep.
Mm.
And so the dog was missing, the
Oh
man.
my God. Yeah.
And that was one that was just like, okay, that I couldn't argue with. I couldn't call it autosuggestion, or, I just could not explain that away. So I was still a sort of a reluctant practitioner, if you say, always had the doubting mind. And I must say that, of course, I know this to be true and to be real. You mentioned something earlier about this reductionist materialist paradigm, where we have to sort of see it to believe it, and it has to be measurable to be real, which is just crazy. To me, science and empirical evidence is really just kind of traveling in the wake of reality, making notes about the very tip of the iceberg that can be observed. It's a descriptive form, that's all. Um, and this whole matter of seeing something to believe it is very sad. And I had to flip that around. I had to believe it to be possible, in parentheses. I had to believe it to be possible to actually see it. As we go through life, there's so much that we don't see, aware, hear, contemplate, or even feel, because we don't believe it to be possible. And so we are inadvertently shutting ourselves off from a very rich and wonderful, experience of so much. And yeah, nowadays when I do consultations, even with wildlife, and often in very dire circumstances, injured rhinos from a poaching incident, or just really tough situations where the stakes are high, or an elephant is broken out of a reserve and is going to be shot if it doesn't make its own way back, all of these sorts of things. It's not like my mind now, my thinking mind is just blissfully quiet. There's still the thinker. I don't doubt that this is real, but I still wonder if I'm getting the information directly from the animal or not, sometimes. And of course, going into any communication, we can't but already have some preconceived ideas, which is why it's so difficult with our own animal friends, because we know so much about them already anyway. It can be tough for new information to stand out on the inner radar screen, as unique. And of course, we're often attached to what they have to say, because we're emotionally involved and attached to the outcomes or their answers. But with what we know about certain species, or what we're potentially expecting or even hoping for from a scenario, is going to be there. So it's there, these thoughts and that are in the background. And that's the trick, is to keep them in the background, to allow them to be, sort of comments from the peanut gallery, and just get on with being present to the communication and the animal's truth anyway. And what I have found helpful with that is sort of offline, having spiritual practices that are more meditation orientated, non-duality, or Advaita Vedanta, finding ways to be in witness where I can hold, many things at the same time, even apparent contradictions. And so if I'm asking an animal a certain, question, I might have five possible answers already in my mind that anybody could, expect. And can I be still enough to feel if there's a sixth, different piece of information that is their truth, or if one of those five is their truth? So it's about this kind of refinement, inner refinement, and constantly doing the personal clearing work to try and clear out my own judgments, hopes, expectations, wishes, and that's, I think, going to be a lifelong practice. Got to keep on clearing the channel. Good old pipe cleaning is what's needed.
I'll just make a comment, and then I really want to ask you about how you receive. I mean, you sort of alluded to it with symbols or images from these animals, but it's very much for me when you mentioned trusting the knowing that you're receiving and being present. I have that very much with, and I think perhaps I'm not alone in terms of listening to your intuition or your gut, however you want to label it. And every time when I go against it, because I doubt because my thinking brain wants to be right in a certain area, or it doesn't want to abandon something that my inner knowing is telling me that I need to. And every time you go against that, it's never good. Like
Yeah.
but equally it does take discernment to see. Uh, Also, as you said, like if I've got a preconceived notion over something that I want to already be right, then my intuition can also be in alignment with that on some way, because there might be variable answers to the question. So that discernment, as you mentioned, it is a process of refining, and there's a lot of practice to even to keep yourself in integrity when you're even asking the questions to begin with, which is
Yep.
difficult. Yeah. So it's a bit that's more that's more. I find meditation as well. That's the place where that work is best undertaken for me
Mm.
anyway, in that silence. But with yeah, so how do all animal? Is there a different sort of cadence and tone that each animal has when they're communicating with you? How does it show up? Uh,
Mm.
is there a commonality?
Yeah, the it's no less, easy or or more difficult with different species, for example. So I was just thinking this morning as I was going around checking for trapped insects who got trapped in overnight to let them out. I was just thinking that I'm probably a bit of a sizist. I choose the biggest flies and bees first because they're kind of bigger and more obvious. And the teeny weeny little ones like the size of the fleas, probably don't get my attention or are last. And I was like, wow, I'm being prejudiced. I'm being a sizist.
I don't think Peter Singer would hold it against you in his.
Why I hope
I
not.
think you'd be all right.
Exactly.
That'd be pretty
Exactly.
harsh if it got down to
Yeah, as
the
you can see,
size of the insects.
I'm not over judgment yet. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Judging
yeah.
myself here.
Well, that's. I don't think even the Jainists would hold that against you. They might do. You
Well,
never know.
they wouldn't be
Those
Jainists
judge
if
those
they did,
judge
would
yeah
they?
those judgmental Jainists. They're
Oh
notorious
no.
for it.
Could go down a rabbit hole here. Exactly.
I'd love to. So, can you actually hear from insects as well? Is that?
Oh yes.
Oh,
Oh yes,
okay. Well,
absolutely. Yeah, yeah. So it really is possible with all sizes and shapes,
yeah.
really. Gosh, yeah, there's quite robust stuff I've had happen with, with insects, with bees, and actually bees is a good example because well, there's a puddle of water outside and one's out of reach in the channel or something, then I actually ask them to swim closer to me so I can reach them. Again, getting into their perspective. So I imagine that I'm in their body without being sort of weird and body snatching about it, but I imagine from their perspective that they're looking out with compound vision and seeing this, humongous, clumsy human hand reaching out towards them. And then I have to engender a feeling of trust and calm and peacefulness, like it's okay. Yeah, it's okay. This is your way out of here. And then I visualize the steps of what I plan to do. along with all the feelings of reassurance, because this is as much a heart-based communication as, something that involves our mental minds. It really is all about coherence and the heart field, meaning our intention, basically, and our energy. So, I mean, it used to be I'd have to dash around with, glass and a piece of paper and to catch everything. But now at least 50% of the insects, even stuck up against the window, I just hold out my hand and reassure them and ask them to walk towards and climb on, and which isn't a pleasant prospect for them. Who knows what, human smells are offensive to their delicate senses. It's this, huge thing. And then I say, please hold on tightly while I move, through space to release you outside. And I give them the mental image and the feeling of outside and freedom and independence and fresh air. So they know what this temporary inconvenience will result in, what the reward is at the end. And most do, they just hop on and hang on for the ride. When it comes to something like bees, that I said is a good example, because it also speaks to the fact that there's communication with an individual animal, like, one bee, but the matter of communicating with a collective consciousness is also possible. So I'm currently in the sort of final couple of months of writing a book that is stories from my consultation career. And one story happened at the Findhorn Foundation at the Findhorn Garden on the north coast of Scotland, where while I was facilitating a workshop there, a wild swarm of bees arrived, which is a very exciting thing because there's very few swarms of bees anymore, or very few hives that survive in a rather desolate landscape, also with everything that's happening environmentally, contextually speaking. So there was much excitement, and there was no empty hive set up or anything, and they were very high up a very tall tree. It took, a long extension ladder to get anywhere near them. And essentially, we wanted to encourage them to stay, but they wouldn't have just stayed there overnight. They were going to move on before sunset. And so I had to find out from them what would motivate them to stay, what they needed. And they were all up there. So essentially, myself and a few others, we sat at the bottom of the tree and made ourselves still and calm. And I'll talk about the process in a bit. And we directed our communication, our intention to connect with the sort of the group of bees, the collective consciousness. And then responses we got to our questions had the sort of the feeling or the spirit of we. Well, we would like, or we need. It's not like there's necessarily one spokesbee who stands up and speaks in the first person, because they're also not communicating in that way. When language happens in my head, it's not because they know English or are expressing in language. It is expressing in pure quantum energy, and then my brain goes through a translation internally. I receive that incoming energy in its raw form that's not even describable. And then it has to sort of move up through my subconscious, from my unconscious through my subconscious, and run against my mental database of stored life experiences, vocabulary words, senses. And when it finds the closest match, then ping, a word or a mental image, or even a sort of like a clairvoyant, or sort of, like a remote smell might come up for me. And so the bees were very clear about what they need. They needed to obviously have shelter with, in a container, a hive or a home that had its back to the prevailing wind and was facing southeast, so it would get the morning light, a certain height off the ground, and etc., within a certain distance from the naturally flowering plants and gorse bushes on the dunes. And with these design specs hastily scribbled down on a piece of paper, and the gardeners and the beekeepers, a couple of hobby beekeepers, they scurried around, went to the woodshed and found, something they could spruce up. And there was much activity as we raced against the clock before the light was lost. And this, newly prepared hive was balanced on bicycle handlebars and cycled off to the place that met those specifications. And then the most amazing thing is back to the bottom of the tree, communicating with the bees and saying, okay, we have basically built what you wanted, and it's over there, but we need to take you there now. Please climb into this cardboard box, so we can take you there. And it's amazing, the vast majority of them just came into this cardboard box that was held high above the head of the elder, John. He was standing on his tippy toes on the very top rung of the ladder, holding up this cardboard box above his head. Most of them came in, brought the box down, and we don't know if the queen is in there or not. And if she isn't, it'll be devastating. They won't go into a hive without the queen, and we don't want to separate them. So again, I had to communicate with, the collective consciousness of, those inside the box and say, is your queen with you? And got a feeling of yes, trusted that, popped the box of bees on the bicycle handlebars. Leslie cycled along and we got to the newly hammered into the ground pole and basically rehomed them there. Didn't even want to do the usual thing of opening up the top of the hive and shaking them in, because many bees get injured and some even killed in that rather, sort of violent process. So we just simply opened up the box and created a little wooden gangplank and a sheet, a sort of an old sheet, to create a bit of and invited them to cross if they wanted to, still always giving them the choice. It's always their choice. And they did. They went across. Yeah, it was just amazing. So yeah, insects, octopi, fish, elephants, you name it. Worms, snakes, the whole lot. Just a beautiful array of beings. And of course, around some of these species, we have programmed human prejudice. But it's important to know that there's just wonderful, conscious, sentient life expressing in many different forms, no matter size or cognitive skills or even the presence of an anatomical brain like we would know it or not. Technically speaking, my work is interspecies communication, including plants as well.
Oh, yeah. I mean, all the stories you hear from indigenous cultures about how they know so much about the plants, and they just say, "Well, they told me, or they told
Yeah.
us." I mean, it's
Yeah.
somewhat the most logical explanation there is. Just with well, there's two burning questions. What I'll just quickly touch upon one. Are there species or animals? I mean, all animals have different mental capacities, but are there ones, firstly, which are as intelligent as what, let's call it, science would say, such as dolphins? Do you notice a difference in intelligence, a palpable difference between some species? Uh, and I just wanted to say something on which is really fascinating. They've found people now in the quantum biology field who have been missing. They only found out, for example, they were missing, like, I think it's up to 90% of their brain. Like they had no idea. They fell ill. They went in for a brain scan, and then they discovered 90% of your brain's offline. And these are people who are operating perfectly cognitively, held fairly high up jobs, no perceived downside to that. And the only explanation is that they're tapping into some larger field of awareness that the intelligence is coming to them through, such as flow states, for example. So it's it's just interesting also that science is the good parts of this inquisitive new frontier of science, where they're finally looking into the things which the ancients have talked about forever. And all of a
Yes.
sudden it's new and miraculous. But I mean, look, it's the language of our times, and for, like, if it gets us there, it gets us there. That's fine. But it's
Yeah.
matching exactly what you said, with that there is
Yeah.
this field, and once you tap into this field, there's and lastly, I just want to say, like, I have it because I do quite a lot of running still, trail running, and there's all snakes quite often that will come on the path, and I've trained myself not to freak out. I'm quite calm. And I simply just, I just think, I said, don't worry, you go, I'm not going to hurt you, go on. And nine
Yeah.
times out of 10, they'll just, instead of freezing, they'll just sliver off immediately.
Yes.
And I have no fear of getting
It's
bitten by them, because I'm no threat to them.
exactly, exactly. Fear is the biggest, sort of obstacle to any relationship or encounter. And when we are afraid, we're putting fear into the field right there.
Mm,
And most animals will, of course, they'll all sense that. And most animals' response to that is, oh my gosh, like something's really scary here. I better defend myself. Plus, they can often sense the direction or from which, or the source of the fear, which is, guess what, the human who's afraid. So they might, lash out at you, not because they mean you harm, but just to sort of lash out at the fear, like push away that energy. So yes, absolutely. Same with me and snakes. First time I encountered a venomous snake in South Africa, was my foot was just about to step down, onto it on a trail, and a friend was walking next to me. She catapulted into the air and suddenly was sitting on a branch in a tree, like over there. I'm like, what's wrong with you? And she'd seen it, I hadn't. And fear wanted to happen because of all the programming, again, just, childhood programming and whatever. It's in our collective unconscious,
Mm.
right? Our
Or
prejudice
snakes.
against,
Yeah.
sharks and snakes and so on. But it was like one of those moments where your time slows down. It's like 1 second to impact in a near fatal accident. And there's just this kind of like slow mo matrix kind of thing. And in that 1 second, I could feel this fear energy start to wash over my body. It sort of rose up from my, my idea of the source of, the danger being the snake, the puff adder snake, and it began to wash over my body. But it got about as far as my knees when I made the conscious choice to not freak out. Like you say, you've trained yourself not to freak out. And I was like, just wait. Actually, it's just the snake is here and I'm here too. Like that's just the facts of the matter. It's just the snake is here. And I allowed myself to just really be in a sense of like as if for the first time, just be in this sense of wonder, like, oh, wow, like hello. Just open, like open instead of contract. Fear is very contracting. I open my heart. I'm like, hi. And the fear never got further than my knees. It just dissolved and it just dissipated. And then the puff had a snake to move away, which they're very reluctant to do. They normally do just stay there. So that's so important. And yes, the question of, is it my mind communicating with the mind, which isn't the brain anyway, or the essential nature of the other being? Like yes and no. It's not actually just a sender and receiver. It's just in this whole quantum soup that we're all swimming in. Wherever I place my attention and maybe intention, to be clear, um, then it's like that particular communication channel is louder than all the others. It's a bit like a good old fashioned sort of radio set, when you'd still have a tuning knob. And I remember my grandparents had one, and you sort of turn the tuning knob and you go through all these like statics and then sometimes a frequency of a radio station and static again. And the more refined you are in tuning into the frequency, like literally the signature frequency of the object of your communication, then the clearer the communication. But it doesn't mean it's happening, in a mechanistic way, like sender and receiver. And I've had some interesting chats recently with Rupert Sheldrake, who first proved telepathy between humans and their dogs, um, about this matter. Where is the mind? And his wife is very interested in people approaching death, and like there's a term called terminal lucidity, which is people who have extreme memory loss, Alzheimer's, vascular dementia, have become nonverbal, don't recognize their, family they've known for their whole lives. Suddenly, within a couple of days of dying, they suddenly switch on. They remember everything, not only old personal memories, but they can create new short-term memories. They can see and know so much. And so, yes, science has come to understand that what is the mind it's more of a field, it's more is of a field, and we are operational in that. We're operational in that um, kind of all the time. Anyway, we would just implode if we were to be aware of it cognitively. If our brains, we're aware of all this, we can't process it. The 24 bits per second is the flicker frequency. That's how many bits of data we can process per second, which seems like a lot, but it's not really. Like in 1 second, you've got to be aware of all your peripheral vision and colors and smells and thoughts, and it's not a lot. And what's happening energetically is far more than that. Yeah.
Well, people go, I think, a lot to do with that inability to deal with the sensory overload. People who have a lot of what we would deem mental illnesses
Yes.
can't gate that information,
Yeah.
and hence, yeah, it's just far, and particularly in a culture where maybe in nature you'd be better off, but if in this culture where
Yes.
it's hard enough at a slow rate to deal
Yeah.
with the information download.
Exactly, exactly. And we just can't, and we're not nourishing ourselves through those connections and interrelating, with the more than human world. And I'd just like to touch on the earlier question you had about intelligence as well. Science is fixated on measuring intelligence by human
By
standards.
human standards. Yeah.
Yeah. Just kind of ironic, given that science
Mm.
imagines itself to be terribly objective, but like, hello, the
No,
very sort
it's
of
only
pyramid
yeah.
paradigm just isn't that. So,
Well, it's limited. It's limited too by the instruments by which you're measuring as well.
yeah,
So that's the other great
absolutely.
flaw with science. We think, but yeah, but by what's a method? Like the whole instrument
Yes.
is the limitation
Exactly.
of the
And
awareness.
then the other thing is when something is, discovered to be true, which doesn't change the truth, it's just sort of, gets discovered. There's the experimenter effect and what's their intention or their
But yeah,
prejudice. And then there's a
yeah.
sense usually of academic ownership of it. By the time it's written up and peer reviewed and 7 years later appears in a journal, it's kind of old news anyway. So yeah, intelligence is out there with all beings, and some may exhibit that in more cognitive ways that we humans can relate to, like the species who choose to engage with humans. I mean, the poor beasts have gone and got themselves domesticated and have to live with the repercussions of that, you know,
Yeah,
or,
I've got
or
I've
the
got one over
dolphins or
here.
so
I've got
on.
one over here who's regretting her
Yeah,
ancestors' decision. She's like, I just want to be free, running around hunting things, and I'm stuck in this bloody room
exactly.
listening to you crap on.
Seriously. Well, it is said that cats have never gotten that in Egyptian times. They
I
used to be worshipped. So,
You can tell with cats. Yeah, cats will
yeah,
knife you. Cats will knife you.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I don't buy that they're sleeping 22 hours a day either. They're in
No,
some
they're
other
just
sort of
silently
alpha state. Yeah.
lucid dreaming and plotting against you,
Yeah, you're probably more the latter.
judging you quietly.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Sorry,
So
go
yeah,
on. I cut
intelligence.
you
No,
off.
no, that's just the point stands. Just that intelligence is expressed in many different ways. A single-celled amoeba has intelligence. The way internal parasites in our own bodies organize and replicate and hide, go and hide in organs and everything. That's also a form of intelligence. And again, contextually, even these, viri and superbugs and things like that, they are an evolutionary response, an adaptation response to the context, to the collective, to what's happening. What we judge as illness could actually be making us stronger, on an evolutionary or biological level. So yeah, intelligence expresses in many different ways, but we humans favor the ones that we can relate to. This is also a very classic challenge in conservation and seeking resources and or funds or protection for species that are not, warm-blooded mammals with big brown eyes that people can relate to. So people are very happy to, run around and sort of donating to or supporting conservations of, fluffy tigers or koala bears, but they're much less inclined to care about, armadillos or, slugs crawling in swamps, which are equally deserving of our respect and care and protection because all the non-humans understand that they are merely a part in this great orchestra of life and they don't have a sense of relative importance. Only we do. We're the ones who have the superiority complex.
I read recently. Did you see this article? It was one of the large language models, AI language models, decoded. Uh, I think it's for crows. Was it for crows? They fed through all these different crow calls, and the AI had deciphered a language from it, which is not surprising. But it was
Yeah,
what I mean. I'm sounding a bit cynical, but I'm glad. Look, whatever the method is to get this more widely known. But it's very funny that they were surprised to find that crows are judging you and new people, and they were like, "Here comes Oscar, and we don't like Oscar. Dive bomb
yeah,
him."
yeah,
It's Everything has its own existence in life. We're the ones who aren't observing it. Basically, it's
absolutely.
not like it doesn't exist. No, we are not conscious for the most part to
Yeah.
so much of life that is occurring that sustains us.
That's right. We're just not aware, and all of life is just available and busy emanating its own truth and state of being. That for any other perceptive being to pick up on. One cautionary note about the AI side of things is that, of course, it is all ultimately founded upon and entrained by human thinking, human
Humans.
conditioning,
Yeah.
including even language, which is very limiting. Language is a
Yes.
wonderful tool, and it's by definition, very limited. And I've been involved in several fora and conferences and so on where there is, the so-called interspecies internet and bioacoustics research and the language of the dolphins, the language of this, and it's going some way, but it's never going to speak to an in the moment fullness of what an animal has to express. And it can go very much off piste because it's fundamentally coming from the human relationship with language. And so far, AI is only as good as its, sort of the human paradigm that it's built upon, right down to even AI's, views or statements around its own sentience and sovereignty and rights. So yeah, for
That's
the moment, it's only as good as the human designers. I think that's going to change pretty soon. It's going to become something else entirely. Yeah.
that's exciting and concerning both simultaneously. But I mean, perhaps it's only concerning because we're then assuming already that it's going to behave like we would if we were in a position of power,
Yeah. True.
which is to say terribly, for the most part. Look, I'm very conscious of your time, but I'd love to, I guess, two questions. One around how do people begin to cultivate this within themselves, and then what are some of the well, let's start with that, and I just want to go on to quickly. What are some of the things that people are doing with their companions at home that you see are a real hindrance to their connection?
Mm. So to cultivate this yourself, if you're having any doubts about it being possible, do just think back to occurrences of what you've alluded to earlier, Paul, having our own gut instinct, our own feelings or hunches about things. And when we followed those, things have worked out pretty well. And when we don't, they don't. So gut feelings, instincts, intuition tends to happen spontaneously. And, when it's really needed. And this form of communication is about accessing or activating our focus on our intuition when we choose to. So, how do we deliberately get into that space? It's really about bringing our mind into a state of being that is more calm and open to the connection that's possible in any moment, anyway. And it is all about mind training, really. So, what I found the most helpful in the way I was shown is to just sit calmly and quietly without invoking any particular meditation technique or something I would have to concentrate on, because that would again be keeping the mind too active. But I was mentored in what's called mindful breathing, to just close the eyes, sit quietly, and let my mind, seeing as it insists on being busy with something, let the mind be busy with just watching my natural breathing rhythm. And in so doing, just watching the in breath and the out breath, it's like tricking the mind and saying, okay, just run along and do that then. And plus, watching your breathing has a very calming effect. And to stay here, to just notice, thoughts as they come and go without indulging them, without following those thoughts, just let them come and go. You don't have to experience complete emptiness. And so it's just about coming into a state of peacefulness and calmness. And then you could bring to mind, there's no accident to that expression. You could bring to mind the animal you want to connect with, um, and simply have a feeling of your mind coming into your heart center, where you have a feeling of a heart opening, an openness to connecting with that one that you care about or are interested in. Doesn't have to be one you know from before. It can be more useful starting out with animals you don't know from before, so that you're not already clouded by pre-existing information or knowledge. And so try it with, a bird or a bug in the garden. And intention comes in only as a sort of as a clarification technique. We should not be intending anything for the other, even that they will want to show us anything. So we're not going to intend them to do anything, but we intend for ourselves to be clear. And that's quite a strong force. It's a good power to use with yourself to say, I intend to receive information clearly. And be sure in that. Say it to yourself as many times as you need to believe it. I intend to receive information clearly. And then let go of that intention and just again be open, watching your breathing. And it can be useful to lead a communication with a couple of questions, just one at a time, but nice open questions. You want them to be open so you've got the maximum chance of receiving the animal's truth, not only a response to your preconceived ideas, which can be quite sort of binary. If you right now there's a bird of black color sitting out on the tree out the window I'm looking at, and if I ask, "Are you happy?" Well, I could get a feeling of no, but that doesn't tell me how the bird is feeling. Doesn't mean he or she is sad either. it could be contemplative or hungry or sleepy or cold. So I won't say, "Are you happy?" I just sit here quietly and I say, "How are you feeling?" So I keep it open, which is as much a feeling in me. Don't forget, it's our feeling that is resonating with them and sort of pinging them. Um, which is why if one of my black cats is sitting on the other side here right now, and if I say to him, at lunchtime, I'm going to dismember you and cook you in a pot to feed my body. He's not taking it particularly seriously because it's not about the words, right? It's the loving energy. So it is the energy of what we're saying. So do that. Ask a nice open question. It'll sound like you're asking it to yourself. You don't have to speak. It's a silent question. It's a silent interest. And then you just let it be. Allow some space and stillness, some quietude to see what information emerges on your inner landscape. Of course, instantaneously the animal has received this ping of your interest and is showing you something in one version of how this works, but it doesn't mean we get it immediately. We usually have to sift through our own distraction or, unpresence. So just sit present for as long as possible for some information to emerge. You might get many different feelings or things coming. Notice which one either comes back more than once or stands out for you more or is the more subtle, because our mind tends to carry a big stick, and that can be the more prominent information, can be, what is the loudest on the inner landscape, but the more soft and subtle tends to be the intuitive. And be open to it coming in any way. It's not that the animal, it's not to say the black bird over there is choosing to send me a feeling of hunger in their stomach or choosing to send me the word hungry. They're just showing their hunger, if that's what's going on. That's just true. That's busy emanating from them on a frequency level. And depending on my internal orientation, if my brain is more attuned to words, which it is, I'm quite analytical. If I were more artistic, I might get, a visual, of a beautiful plate of worms or something. If I'm more emotional, I would get the feeling. If I'm more kinesthetic, I get a sort of rumbling tummy. Be open to it coming in any way, and just notice that. And it's a lovely way to as you transition outdoors, even if it's just to rush down to the bus or the train or something to get to work, just take a moment to become present with the change in environment. Just greet the day, greet the trees, send out this wave of good energy and of greeting, and you might be surprised what comes back.
God, sorry, you made me very much think of it's right to my front of mind. I was going to ask you with, and you don't, you can tell me if this is a bit off topic, but have you ever asked an animal about what their feelings on death is? And let me give this a bit more of a frame, because I think a lot of people they'll look at the animal kingdom and they'll say animals are violent and predatory and all of these. They ascribe these these violent attributes to animals, and I've always had the feeling that there's no malice in what they're doing. It's very much they do what they need to do and no more than to survive, which is very contrasted to humans. It's very different. Like we do beyond, far beyond what we need to do to survive. Sorry, that was my initial thought to how we firstly perceive. So then, within that, with our endless fear of death, and I perceive animals to be very much more present in the moment, all
Yeah.
if not all the time. Have you had any feedback on how they perceive moving into another dimension or leaving this one?
Yeah. Yeah, you're spot on there. Animals do not see physical death as something to be feared, or I mean, I think we humans are unique in trying to avoid the inevitable, to the extent that we do, and with the anxiety that we do. Of
Mm.
course, there's the survival imperative, and a prey animal is still going to run away from the lion that's chasing it. Of course, there's the survival imperative, but when the lion catches up to the impala and has it in the death grip, around the throat here, even though the impala's body might be struggling and it's going through the dying process, you'll see, if it's very good documentary footage, you'll see that the eyes of the impala are calm. They're not super wide in fright necessarily. They're not glazed over from shock. They're calm. They've accepted what's coming. And yes, all the other species aside from human really do deeply know and regard death as just a transition in a state of being. It's just a transition in a state of being. You have a body and then you don't. And it's what's very important to them is quality of life, wild and domestic. What's important to them is quality of life rather than being attached to having to live as long as possible. And I have found this very helpful in my own life with animal companions, and then later on in consulting, very helpful when it comes to things like with our domesticated companions who live with us. When it comes to these sort of last months or years of life, there's a whole question of, gosh, are they suffering too much or not, or how much medical intervention or not? You can really ask them about that, see what they do, or see what they do or don't want, depending where they are with fulfilling on the role that they're there to perform, one of many roles. They're sentient, self-aware beings. They have roles and purposes and things to do here that's beyond just, being our guard dog or even our beloved companion. They've got many roles. They're probably also friends and community members or have a relationship with place very strongly. So it's about quality of life and richness of life, which is why things like factory farming are just completely heinous and absolutely awful for obvious quality of life reasons. But because we don't see it, we lock it all away, behind the doors of the batteries where the hens are being kept or the sow crates and everything. We don't see it, and they're just basically been propped up and kept existing. And that's different than how hunter-gatherer tribes used to relate to even the animals that they did eat as meat. Hunter-gatherer tribes had as much reverence and respect for the plants that they went to find or the animals that they hunted. Both activities were preempted by a deep prayerful state, a deep communication to the plant species or to the elk species, explaining the human need that was a genuine need, not just greed. Explaining the human need and respectfully asking that if it was, in the highest good, that need could be answered and an animal or a plant could make a sacrifice for their human survival. Could they, the next day be shown when they go out foraging or go out tracking, could they be shown a way to ones who are willing to, contribute to their wellness? And so, and we all come from some common, human ancestors, didn't differentiate between animal life and plant life for that matter. And who's to say plants aren't intelligent just because they can't run away and just because they can't move or express in ways we are used to doesn't mean they don't have their own deep relational experience of life and their their beautiful, purposes and joy, and they deserve our respect as much as the others. So, how are we treating those that nourish us, plant or animal? If we are vegetarian or vegan, can we be in a state of true gratitude for the soul, the essence of that plant that has given up their life for us? Are we conscious of the quality of life they've had? I've had some chats with some trees or fields of corn that are having a miserable experience, pesticides being grown in strange formations. I mean, there's one orchard of trees where the trees at the front of the rows were having an incredibly hard time having to take the full brunt of the elements, basically being the first to catch the wind and the harshness of the sun without protection, and not being allowed to grow in community where they would naturally offer each other a bit of shade as the sun passes the course of the day, so that they would share the burden of the elements. Yeah, it's these considerations that bring us into the intelligence of all life, and all of life knows that physical death is just a transition in a way of being, and that's not where the story ends. That in dropping the bodies, the ingredients, the components of their bodies go back to nourishing the whole. So there is this beautiful relationship with metamorphosis and being part of the cycle of life, even in the final gifting of one's own flesh back to the earth to nourish the others. It's a beautiful offering, a beautiful giveaway.
Well, there's no life without death. Like,
Yeah.
it's impossible, and
Right.
it's very funny when you hear about these people wanting to live forever or uploading their consciousness or whatever. Like, I'm all for longevity and a healthy long life and living it full
Mm.
of vigor and so on, but yeah, it seems you're missing life completely if the aim is not to die.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there's this, it's to be fully alive, we need to have faced our own death so that we can really be like, woohoo, wow, like you're here for the ride while it's here. And to get over our ideas of things. When I was teaching in Byron Bay several years ago, I hopped over to Heron Island afterwards for a few days. And it was coinciding with the, migrating bird season when they come to nest. And not going to forget, I have forgotten the name of the particular bird species that basically use their poo to glue a few of these flat leaves together to make a very flat nest for the duration of what they need and their chicks and so on. But those particular trees, and here in Ireland's only a few hundred meters long, but those particular trees also secrete a gum or a resin that gets the birds' feet and legs all tangled up, and ultimately they can't move and they fall to the base of the tree. And after they've died, their decomposing flesh goes into the soil, and the seeds of that species of tree will not germinate if there isn't the presence of the decomposed body of that particular species of bird. So, yeah, this just turns this whole value of animal life being more important than plant, on its head. Those trees need the animal flesh to survive, but we don't go around, judging those trees, do we? There's this symbiosis in everything. Mm.
Uh, and I really don't know what to add. That's such an incredibly beautiful way to. You've actually these are things, as I said, you sort of intuitively know and sort of conceptualize, but you've just put that in such a beautifully poetic sense that I'm sort of aghast at my own ignorance to the fullness of life.
Mm.
When you get caught up in your own little life and its wants and desires, when the whole of life is accessible to you.
It's amazing. And the best thing to do is to just step outside. I saw a lovely, it was the branding for some outdoor school. It's like, think outside, no box required. So literally just step outside. You could do it right now. It's nighttime where you are. Just step outside and be with the stars, not as a concept or a sort of, you know, a scientific contemplation. Just be with the night air, be with the feeling. We are wonderfully alive and sensory animals ourselves as well. And the moment we go outside, we are plugging back into that unknowingly. And maybe that's part of the secret, right? Without knowing, without our minds becoming too involved, we're just plugging back in. And that really helps us connect, communicate, and have our intuition opened as well, because all of life is living in this fantastic symphony, and we are part of that orchestra. And they want us to play and to be heard as well. So we just step outside, preferably barefoot, and are just there. All sorts of things begin to turn on again. Mm.
I'm actually going to do that before I before I go to bed. You've inspired me. Just lastly, where can I know you're doing conservation work now? So where can people find out more about that and help in that in
Thank
effort
you.
as well?
Thank you so much. Yeah, the conservation consulting I do is all pro bono. Um, Ironically, because no person owns those animals, so they're not considered financially valuable. And most conservation work is just a labor of love. It's the NGOs, the non-profit organizations, the rescue, the rewilding, the very undervalued in our world. So they don't exactly have spare change to just pay for the consulting time or even the resources that they need on the ground. My website's rather old and out of date, but it does have a page on how one can donate towards my wildlife efforts. So the website is Animal Spirit, that's singular, animalspirit.org. I also have a YouTube channel by the same name, Animal Spirit. And but on the website, there's a link to donate towards the wildlife work, which I do. I do that mostly remotely. And the last little while, I've been living in Spain and will be for another couple of months yet. So not too much, raw wildlife in southern Europe, but inevitably the animal welfare things happening in the hills and the wild goats that get stuck on fences and all those things as well. Just keep me more than busy. So, wherever we are related.
Mm. Well, we're made up from the very elements for wherever we are on the planet, either way. And
Yes. Yes. And that's a beautiful way to, with our minds, also acknowledge our kinship with all life, because we are cut from the same cloth. So why wouldn't we be able to communicate and connect?
yeah,
Mm.
after this conversation, I'm very much going to reflect. Because I think most people have had moments where they've felt that and they've dismissed it, and I've certainly had many where I've dismissed it, and rather than actually believe it. And
Yeah.
but it's sort of somewhat when I reflect now, it's somewhat undeniable. There's things that happen where you're just like, that's too uncanny for it not to be something more going on than my imagination.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I was so skeptical for those first couple of years, even while doing it. I found it helpful to keep a little bit of a journal, just making notes of other intuitive, promptings, not related to animals, other little gut instincts about, people, places, what to do, where to go, choices, and how they played out. And pretty soon, wow, the sheer weight of evidence was very overwhelming because along the way, the ego based thinking mind tends to dismiss these things. But if you do just take a couple of weeks to write them down, yeah, one notices just how intuitive we actually are. And can we internally and in our external lifestyle, can we make space for that again? So that becomes perhaps the primary sort of foreground way of navigating through our days.
Mm. A return to, I'm going to let you go, but I was just going to say a return
Mhm.
to eldership as well, because I guess what comes with that when you realize you're tapped into all of creation and all of life itself is a responsibility to behave accordingly.
Yeah,
And we're in a very
yeah,
immature world that doesn't want to take accountability for
absolutely.
anything.
Absolutely. And the word responsibility, I like to break down into two parts. What is our ability to respond? What is our response ability? And, we all have certain gifts and talents and propensities. We don't want to get completely overwhelmed and think it's all on our shoulders or get into compassion fatigue. But, yeah, we need to be responding in some way that is, appropriate and balanced in terms of our capacity. And there is this, in the web of life, it calls for this eldership, this responsibility, wisdom, discernment, and ultimately humility. Can we be humble as humans and open to participating in a collaborative way? Mm.
Anna, thank you for your work. Thank you for your time. I've so enjoyed speaking with you. And let me know if you're coming back to Australia again anytime soon. It'd
Yeah,
be
I hope
wonderful
to. I
to
hope to in the next year or so. It would be a great
I'd
wish
be
of mine.
wonder
Yeah,
yeah good.
yeah,
Yeah, it'd be wonderful to meet you in person and enjoy Spain
yeah.
while you're still there. And thank you for today.
Thank you, and thank you for the great questions and inquiries and comments. Yeah, very rich conversation. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.